I'm
What's up,
doing well.
Greg?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Greg.
you joining us. So, everyone, this is Greg Bishop. He's a senior writer at Sports Illustrated Magazine, my old stomping ground. He primarily covers NFL, but he also does kind of a hodgepodge. He's written stories, cover pieces for a lot of sports. He just got back from Qatar covering FIFA 2022. So he's here to tell us a little bit about his experiences, what he saw, what he tasted, some of the controversies, a little bit about USA soccer, a little bit about Canada losing 0-3. But before we get to that,
Canada.
we want to give Greg the question of the hour that we usually pose to all of our guests. Tell us something, Greg. Tell our listeners and our viewers something that they cannot Google about you. Like your
Mm.
profiles online, they can easily access all of your stories, but what can they not Google about you?
Well, it's funny. I've been thinking of a good answer here while we've been setting up, and everything that I thought of initially seemed like the answer you'd give in a job interview. Like I work too hard is my biggest weakness, or something like that. So I'll keep it real with you guys. My wife hates sports. She doesn't read a word that I write, and so one thing you can learn about me that you can't find on Google is I watch a ton of reality TV. We're not watching the NBA finals at home. We are watching
Wow.
Real Housewives of Atlanta
Oh wow,
and
you're a
things
Real
of
Oh my
Housewives guy.
God.
Uh-oh.
yeah.
No,
That's
no,
so crazy.
no.
We're gonna keep it real on that one, and yeah, actually, it's a little embarrassing to say that out loud, but here we are.
What
Like
else do you
there's
watch? What
true.
other
Great.
reality TV do you watch? What are we talking?
A lot of Real Housewives. We love The Challenge. If you guys watch that show,
I've
we
seen it.
watch that
Mhm.
a
Yes.
ton, and pretty much if it's on Bravo, I've seen it. I
So like
can't say I
Married at
love them.
First Sight and 90 Day
Project
Yeah,
Fiance.
Runway, Top Chef, all that good
See,
600
stuff.
there's proof
pounds.
that
Yeah, yeah,
you're
yeah. Oh,
living
yeah.
proof of karma,
600
Greg.
pounds?
Yeah, 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 all of it. And so
See,
I,
living
I
proof
spend my
of
day
karma.
trying to tackle, yeah, spend my day trying
You
to
get to
tackle the
live the
weighty.
dream of getting to all these pro sporting events, and then your real life is just garbage TV. This is amazing.
Garbage
Yeah,
TV.
throw in what my kids watch. You got a lot of Blippy, you got some Paw Patrol, and basically I spend half my day working my brain and the other half making it dumber. So here we are.
That's
Balance.
Nice,
hilarious.
nice, nice. Well, thank you for being so candid with us and sharing. I'll have to
Not
clown
sure
you
it's a
about
good
that
idea,
later
but
on.
you know.
But yeah, so you just got back from Qatar. How long were you there?
I spent 20 days there in an
Okay.
apartment complex. I lived with Brian Strauss, SI soccer writer, and yeah, just got back off the 15-hour flight about 48 hours ago.
Okay. And so when
15
did
hours.
you learn or find out? Because you primarily cover NFL for Sports Illustrated, but when did you find out that you were going to the World Cup?
I think it really started maybe 6 to 8 months ago. I was interested in going out and writing about the migrant workers specifically before the World Cup and having a piece kind of as the lead up. The only other time I've covered a World Cup was in Brazil, and it was fun. I did sort of a travelogue. I stayed 36 nights in 7 different cities with Simon Broody, who's like a
Woo!
salty British photographer. We were in the same room
I know
every
Simon.
night, and
Ooh.
I saw as much of Simon as any person would ever want to. And yeah, I think it has died. They sort of know me as like I like doing weird stuff. I've written about Roger Federer's footwork, Manny Pacquiao's entourage, The Art of Trash Talk with Bart Scott. Did a whole series one time on what NFL players do on Mondays, which are worse than our Mondays. How they recover from all the car wrecks and everything that they've had. And so I think the setting here is what appealed to me. It's a unique place. Obviously, quite a few issues going in that weren't going to be resolved. Throw in FIFA and their usual shenanigans, and I think they were drawn to the fact that I would go out there and write about anything except soccer as much as I could. And then as we got closer, it just became a matter of everything in journalism these days, which is could we afford it? How long would I
Yeah.
go? Would it be long enough to really dig in? Because it did take a few days to sort of have a brain out there. And could I compliment Brian in a way that, two of us could cover what the Athletic did with 25 people or what the New York Times did with 15? And so between all of that stuff, it sort of landed. And then I'd say I found out for real I was going about 2 months ago.
So, real quick
Okay.
question.
Wow.
So, you mentioned the migrant workers. So, can you explain exactly what you were going to cover with that, or what your plan was?
Yeah. So the way one of the really interesting things about Qatar is that 90% of the people that are there are not from there. The 10% of the people that are actually Qatari natives, they don't have to work at all. They're subsidized by the government in terms of housing, in terms of food, in terms of lifestyle. And essentially, people come from all over the world to work there. What was interesting when I got there, and this will inform the migrant workers' answer, is there's almost like caste systems within a caste system. And so most of my taxi drivers, and I took a ton of Ubers out there, were from southern India or Bangladesh or, somewhere like Pakistan. Most of the coffee shops that I went to were filled with Filipino workers who had come from the Philippines. And most of the people in
Okay.
the restaurants served us when we did occasionally get a real meal were from Europe. And the migrant workers are their own set. So they're mostly from Nepal, from Kenya, places like that. And this is a place that 10 years ago, it wasn't big at all. There was where the World Cup final will be held is a place called Lusail, and there must be 100 huge towers there. And I had this cab driver I befriended when I was over there, and he said that when he came 11 years ago, they had started building two of the towers total. There was like one lane roads, there was no highway. And so, in order to host the World Cup, Qatar had to really look at infrastructure. It had to build hotel rooms, it had to build freeways, it had to build everything. And, the people that helped build these stadiums, they didn't just build stadiums, they built everything else. And the reason I was drawn to writing about them is a lot of people died while building them. I talked to one migrant worker for a story that's not out yet, who saw two people fall to their deaths. Like literally fell and landed right next to him. You're talking no harness, no safety, no water. I mean, the conditions were absolutely deplorable. And I wrote
Yeah.
when I was there quite a bit about the you had to keep those people in mind regardless of everything else that's going on.
We had discussed that very topic last week, Greg, and I know that when I had looked at it, initial figures were somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,500, but I know the Qatari government is saying it was like dozens of people who died, and other estimates from European nations are scoring it at like 10 to 11,000. So, what what did you find?
Yeah, I think the most often cited number is the first one you gave. 6,500 came from the Guardian's independent investigative reporting. Seems to be well accepted.
500 people died.
Yeah, I would
Migrant.
say that it's a little bit tricky though, because that's only looking at stadiums. There have been improvements in some areas of the way that the system is set up for people that are unionized and have come to work. But I walked like 9 to 10 miles a day when I was out there, and it didn't matter if it was 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon. People were working on stuff. My last night, I stayed up all night because I didn't want to miss my flight and get in trouble at home. And I was walking by Khalifa International Stadium, which is where the U.S. lost to the Netherlands yesterday, and people were still working. And it was 5 in the morning, and there was nobody else on the street. And this is just the way it was. And so any of those figures that we're talking about are exponentially higher because there were workers who built all these huge hotels. There were workers that built all these restaurants, some of which are only going to be open, according to people I talked to there, for 3 months. They're just going to
Mhm.
open, do the World Cup, and end. And so when you're talking about how many people died in order to put on the World Cup in Qatar, it has to be tens of thousands. There's absolutely no way it couldn't be.
Wow.
And and so when you got the call, when you got confirmation that you were going to go to Qatar, how did you prepare? Like, what did you have to do? Was there a list of do's and don'ts that you were presented by Sports Illustrated, by FIFA, by your wife? Like, what? How did you prepare for
Yeah,
20 days in Qatar?
I mostly did my own research. So part of that was looking up stories and things that I could pursue. But I looked up a lot about the customs, in part because, I'm sort of a reactive person. I'm not necessarily like the most amazing at authority and being respectful. I
Mm.
think people would tell you from my life. And the customs there were wild. You're not allowed to, it's illegal to flip somebody off. It's illegal to, you're not supposed to like do
Wow.
the thumbs up. My wife always laughs because when we go international somewhere, she says my
What?
default anxiety thing is the double barrel, which is two thumbs up, like this. That, that in their culture is considered disrespectful. You're not supposed to call
Wow.
someone over like this and say, "Come here when you need your bill." You're supposed to open the palm of your hand like this and say, essentially, "Come and see me." And so there are all these things.
Wow.
You're not supposed to shake a woman's hand unless she offers it. You're not supposed to sit next to a woman on public transit. I mean, there were cultural norms and laws that just were going to be in place, and that was part of what I wanted to write about. But I also was really cognizant of not causing an international incident. I didn't want to become the American journalist that went out there and
Right.
offended people. And I really worked hard, and like I had this list of customs that I read over and over and over again because I just wasn't going to be that guy.
That was smart. Yeah. Well, I have
That's
a quick
Very.
amazing.
question. Do you feel like um uh, have you been other places where there were different customs and unusual customs and things like that, or is this like the one place that you found that the customs were just different, completely different?
Yeah, I've covered sports on 6 continents, in my career, so I feel like I've been a lot of places with different customs, but this was this was very unique. It was different, and I think part of it was the backdrop. As you saw the tournament get closer, the Qatari government didn't just let things go. I mean, people were getting detained, whether it was members of the LGBTQ community or journalists that had gone there to report. A lot of weird stuff happened to me out there, and I'm not sure if it's all in my head, but there were times
Wow.
when I would be on my laptop and I'd see the cursor moving when I wasn't touching it. There were times when I
Uh,
logged on to Facebook and I had 10 accounts rather than the two that I actually have.
hmm,
There were times where I had
What?
sources who asked me to leave my apartment complex and turn off my Wi-Fi in order to talk to them. There were migrant workers that I spoke with that asked the people that were handling them asked me to leave the stadium and walk off the perimeter. I think it's pretty safe to say, and I have no
Very.
proof of this, that we were being tracked out
being
there.
monitored.
I know for sure
You
that
probably
the
were.
government was very strongly saying that Western journalists are racist, and that was the reason for our writings. And it all just like felt very tense and uneasy most of the time I was there,
Mhm.
even when I was able to find things that were not tense or uneasy and in some ways beautiful and poetic. So it was uh it was just a really like I felt like every day I was really making sure I didn't screw up, and there were 100,000 ways in which I could.
So,
Wow.
did you
That's
screw
Hmm.
pressure.
up?
That's
Did you screw up?
Uh,
Did you
real
get into
question.
any trouble?
not that I know of. Not that I know of. I I think that it's really tricky, right? Like I did a piece on Iran and the protests there, and I spoke to a wrestler who's like trying, he's part of this group that's trying to ban the country from international competitions. And he used to be an athlete for the national team. And, there are stories like that where he spoke very honestly about people he knew who had been killed by the regime, about the current national team and how they're funded in part by it, and about the protests and the kids and women that are getting killed just for asking for some really basic rights. And I remember saying to him, like, isn't this story going to put you deeper into harm's way? And he says, yes. And then what do you do with that? He says, I have to talk. And if I don't put my name on this, people aren't going to believe me and it's not going to be as impactful as it would be otherwise. But I have to weigh in my own head, if something happened to this guy, could I live with myself? And
Mm.
Maybe that sounds dramatic, but I feel like I had to weigh that every day. What am I going to do to the people that I'm writing about? And on the off chance that I get detained for ripping the Qatari government over Budweiser, or for writing as I did that Gianni Infantino deserves to drink Bud Zero for the rest of his life, then what am I doing to my own family? Am I being disrespectful, putting them and myself in harm's way? And so that calculus was ever present every day, the whole time I was there. And even when I started to have these revelations and this real life changing experience, it's still like, I bet they're listening right now.
So when you interacted with other foreigners in Qatar, was this a common feeling for people, or did you see, like, when you saw people getting hassled or being detained, whether it was for public drunkenness, LGBTQ, for just looking at a flag the wrong way and going, "Hey, there's a rainbow there, but no, it belongs on it. It's a national flag." Like, was just your hypersensitivity to the rules, was that pervasive among many of the other tourists?
Most of the people I spoke to, their experience differed based on how much time they spent in the bubble. So most people that were covering the U.S. team, they were at the apartments, they go to training, and then they come back and they write their story. I felt almost bad for Brian Strauss that he wasn't able to get out and see the country. I
Wow.
think the workers that lived there were always concerned. I had this cab driver that I mentioned, Pradeep, who became a close friend, and he followed some rules that were kind of interesting to me. Like, he wouldn't eat with me no matter how many times I asked him. We spent 3 full days together for different stories. He dropped me at a restaurant and he wouldn't come in. There were times when I went to a
Hmm.
restaurant by myself and they always seated me upstairs away from anyone else, which maybe was just me. I don't know. And
Hmm.
I would say more people at least felt the unease. But I think everyone I spoke to out there saw people that were Qatari nationals and the way that they treated workers. And I'm not saying we live in a perfect country, but it was jarring and gross. The way that they spoke to them, the way that they treated them, the way that
My
it's very
God.
clear that there are many levels of class in Qatar, and you're always going to fit in whatever level you are in. And
Hmm.
there were times I wanted to
Wow.
intervene, but I'm just too soft. So,
No, you're
Probably in
I
your
mean, I would
best
imagine
interest.
present there.
it's a different type of reporting. Like, I worked at Sports Illustrated for a number of years as well. Have covered, myriad events in several states and several countries. And the only thing that I was really worried about was, okay, is this athlete going to be pissed about a question that I ask or something that I write, or am I going to make my deadline? I really didn't have to write under this type of pressure that the government is
Yeah.
watching me or that I might get arrested for doing something that is just so normal in my everyday life. So it's a different type of reporting that I honestly can't imagine being in that situation and still being able
Mm.
to be creative and get my story out on the deadline. So
Right.
props to you for that because I think I would have been pissed. I would have been worried a lot of times. And then as a woman, it's just like, okay, well, what can I do
Make
and what
it worse
can't
for
I
you.
do?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I did like when you. I like that you considered the people that were there that you could have affected.
Yes.
As the workers and people, and that you considered that because you don't know what you leave behind. Sometimes you leave behind um, people, and then they have to suffer for whatever actions you had. So I'm glad that you really. I appreciate that you considered those people.
Oh, thank you. I think I've written a ton about mental health the last 5 years. I have a big story coming out on the Holinsky family in a couple weeks, and one of my baseline rules for writing about death and suicide or the Humboldt bus crash or all the things that I get assigned because they're like, "Hey, go to that tragedy and write about it." The first rule that I have for that kind of reporting is do no harm. And so out there, like, I didn't want to write just stories that were palatable. I didn't want to just write things that were fun. And I did some cool stuff like camel racing I wrote about, or I just spent a day at
Wow.
Thanksgiving when I was away from my family trying to find Thanksgiving football in Qatar, and I watched it, in 20 different locations to try to find the sort of soul of Thanksgiving in a different sport.
Right.
And so those stories are great. I didn't want to forget the backdrop, and I also didn't want to write every story and have it be the same. But it's hard to write about some of these things and not acknowledge the people that died, the lives that were lost, the cost of doing all this. And so I wrote one of
Yes.
my last pieces when I was out there was about a kid from I can't remember where he's from, but he got Weston McKinney's jersey after a game, and it was kind of cool.
Hmm.
Like I was missing my kids,
Oh,
and I wanted to write. And Avi Creditor, my soccer editor, great guy, good therapist if you ever need one. We were laughing like this is the first story we wrote that didn't like have a catch-all. There was no like disclaimer of like this is still a terrible place or these terrible things still happen. It was just a heartwarming story about a kid from Florida who got a jersey of a guy who had gotten a picture with Landon Donovan 10 years ago and how really cool that was. I think that was always on my mind too. How was I going to accurately reflect the events? And I wrote a lot about contrast and juxtaposition, and I got some more stuff coming out that will be similar to that.
Tell us about
Greg,
the
I had a
cats.
question. My question is a little bit different than what we've kind of been talking about. And it may be a little general, but what is the most, or who rather, is the most interesting person you feel like you've written about? I know you have
Oh
probably
man.
tons and tons of stories.
Yeah. Oh man. Most interesting person. I would probably skip
Or around.
NFL.
Let's skip NFL.
Yeah.
NFL's not interesting enough.
I mean, there are some
It's
guys I've had some pretty unique conversations with there. Aaron Rodgers has a pretty unique brain.
Oh, wow.
I can
Yes.
imagine. I can imagine his brain being
Yeah, Aaron
crazy.
Yeah.
Rodgers.
If I had to
I'm with
go
Lizzie
career
on that one.
line,
Thumbs down on that.
in 2008, I went to Acoma, New Mexico, and I wrote about the oldest indigenous tribe in North America. And it was before the
Ooh,
Giants, and the Cowboys in the playoffs. I met this guy, Pat Toomey, who played defensive lineman for the Cowboys, wrote on any given Sunday. And we had this trip out to Acoma where they have this huge sandstone rock that they live on, no power, no water, nothing, but they're
what?
huge Cowboys fans. And they actually bring up generators that they take breaks from their religious ceremonies to watch the games or listen to them
oh,
in their
nice,
Wow.
nice.
I'm sitting
Oh,
next to when I got married, they sent me a traditional vase where you like sit from each end of it. And the main guy I profiled out there was a guy named Gilbert Concho, and he had his past since, so RIP. But I just found him fascinating. He loved the Cowboys, he loved his people, his life was really interesting. And, he had
That is
diabetes and there was alcoholism in his family. And yeah, I mean, stories like that stick with you. I've probably got 50 or 60 examples of those.
Yeah, very unique people.
Wow.
Liz, you had a question?
Wow.
so I end up reading a lot of what you were writing from Qatar. Um, a prominent theme was all of the cats that you saw. Um, and I was
Really?
kind of weirded out by that because I have a black cat, and he's a very
Mhm.
wily, bad character. So, but it sounded like there were some cats on a whole other level in Qatar. So tell us about
They
that
roam the
experience.
street.
Yeah, I don't mean to offend anyone on here, but I'm not a cat person necessarily, and these
Either.
cats were interesting. Like you're talking like skeletal cats, it's as thin could be. And basically,
What?
like I'd walk alone at night when I couldn't sleep. It was a very safe country for all the things we're talking about. Like there's not a lot of crime. I actually went for a walk this morning here in Kirkland, Washington, and I felt less safe at 4 in the morning walking around than I did in Qatar in the middle of the.
Mhm.
But the problem
Mhm.
was they
See
had
that?
these like dumpsters out all the time, and in each dumpster there's like 100 cats, and I saw them like fighting and like going
Oh
off,
my
and
God.
people would leave these little bowls of food and water out to feed them, which I thought was kind of cool. But basically, I am a scaredy cat myself. There's your dad joke for the day. And I would jump. Every time I would hear one, I would jump like a crazy person and try to run away. And basically now I have an irrational fear of cats. I don't think I'll ever look at a cat the same way again.
Oh my
The
god, that's
stray cat.
awesome.
That's funny. All right. Any
That is
final
creepy
any
though.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So, are there any final thoughts, any final um, impressions that you had from your time in Qatar? Any last things that you'd like to say?
Yeah, I guess I'd start with the people that I met. So this is the easiest way to answer this. Here's my morning routine. I could never fall asleep there. So I fell asleep between 5 and 6 usually. And then I drag my old self out of bed about 9 o'clock. Right
Oh.
away, I would just hit the block and take a walk around the street. And one thing is, I'm a pretty anxious person in general. I don't really like people, like deep down. I say that as kind of joke, but try to I forced myself when I was there to interact with people I wouldn't interact with. So on my way out in the morning, I'd say what's up to the security guards who were Sudanese. I'd fist bump
Yeah.
them on my journey out. We'd talk about the games on the way. Then I'd like turn the corner of the compound, turn another corner, and then walk down the street with all the stores. There was a barber there who always wore a Yankees hat, and he would yell "Judge" every morning, "Judge, Judge." And some days
Aaron
when we
Judge.
started getting cooler, he'd pull me into the barber shop and he'd trim my beard up. And then I'd go to my coffee
Oh.
shop, and everybody there was Filipino, and I'd show them pictures of myself and Manny Pacquiao, which meant they gave me free cake for breakfast.
Oh,
And
nice.
every morning we sit and talk about our lives. The baker at this coffee shop was from Morocco. They obviously had an amazing tournament, and he'd come in and talk about that. In fact, the day before I left, they had a little party for me at the coffee shop. They had a cake, it had candles,
Aw.
and it was
Oh,
amazing. And then I would go back to the apartment. I'd talk soccer with Brian Strauss, and then I would go to games at night. And I guess what I'm trying to
wow.
say is what I learned in Qatar that I didn't expect to is that there are kind people everywhere in the world, and that I need to push myself more to report on things that I set up ahead of time to allow for serendipity, to allow for connection, humanity, empathy, and understanding. I met a cab driver there. I've mentioned him a couple of times named Pradeep, and he took me to the airport on Friday, and we had this really kind of cool moment. I gave him a handwritten letter with a big tip in it. And I just said, "Thank you, man. Like, you really had an impact on my life, and you'll never understand just how deep it was." And he sent me a letter yesterday. I was showing my kid all the pictures from my trip. And Pradeep sent me this letter and said, like, he never met someone like me before. And, like, to me, um, I guess what I learned is people are not necessarily their governments, that there are places that are bad that have really great people in it. And
Yes.
I've had a rough 6 months for a lot of different reasons, but I left that place telling myself, like, stay here, live in this zone, feel like humanity is there in the world. And it sounds really cheesy to say that out loud. Maybe that should have been my Google answer,
That
but
sounds amazing.
I actually feel very heartened by my trip, and I hope to carry that through into my work in a way that I had been missing for me, in a way that had me thinking about doing something else entirely. And so I think of the list of places I could have gone where I would have said, this place will change your life. Qatar might have been just about last. And yet I am so incredibly grateful for the experience because I think it'll sustain me for a lot longer than I ever thought it would.
Greg, I
It's
have to say,
beautiful.
I
Wow.
highly respect you, and I appreciate what you said. So, um, yeah,
Yeah.
people are important, and they're not their government. I definitely appreciate you. Appreciate you joining us, and you gave a lot of information. Is there any information you want to give about how people can reach you if they want to reach out to you, your Instagram, and all that good stuff?
Sure. Greg Bishop SI, his Twitter, Instagram, and then I'm SI Greg Bishop at Gmail. If you have any story ideas, I'm always on the hunt. And just wanted to say thanks for having
Nice.
me, guys. I droned on a lot, but you can tell, I guess, it was pretty impactful for me.
Okay. Well, thank you
That's
so
Final,
much.
amazing
final
stories.
Was it
question.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
beautiful?
Final
Go ahead.
question.
Go ahead.
Final question. Who's winning? Who you got?
Oh man. Let's see. I think because of the injuries
Rob.
and everything else, I like Argentina. I think
Argentina.
that I think
Argentina.
Oh,
All right.
I
You heard
oh,
it
think that
here.
all right.
Messi looks like he's ready to roll. We've seen him have a huge impact in every game. I went to Argentina, Mexico, about a week ago, and that reminded me of David Foster Wallace's Federer story. It was a religious experience. Like people were crying. I met a guy
Wow.
on the bridge when we were walking over to the Ubers, it says, "You'll just never understand like the way this guy impacted my life." And Messi has this really complicated relationship with Argentina. He's obviously
Mhm.
spent a ton of time elsewhere, and it was just really interesting to see like, can this be in his final World Cup, sort of a mending of the fences, a way to put him in a class with Maradona. And I guess I think in narrative and in story, and I just wonder if this isn't, the ending that everyone in this World Cup needs, something that's
Mhm.
positive, interesting, and
Yeah.
maybe even a little bit heartwarming at the end of the day. Now that still won't change the workers' death, so you guys get the disclaimer too. But
Yeah.
maybe all things can be true, and that's what we're
Right.
hoping for.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you
Well,
so
thank you for
much.
Amazing.
that. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Greg.
Greg.
Go get some
Thanks.
sleep. Take care.